immediately following the master plan update, which was finished in May of 2018. Immediately following the master plan update, we started really working at how we implement that master plan, and started with really evaluating what we learned during the master plan update. And that really set the stage for why we were doing this land use code update now. So one of the things that we feel really strongly about, and what led us to this, is a strong feeling that our current land use regulations, our specific development regulations in particular, no longer serve us very well as a county. We think that those regulations are unpredictable, they negatively impact our economy, and they place undue burden on property owners and neighbors. They lack clarity and specificity, and they've led to a lot of neighborhood and community conflict over the years. And we feel like it's time to do something different than specific development. We want new regulations that are fair and predictable and ultimately reduce regulatory burden. Goals of this update process have been to ensure due process includes a simple, clear, and fair, predictable process for property owners and neighbors, provides clarity and assurances to residents and property owners about how land might develop around them, and creates consistency between the vision and goals in the master plan with our development regulations. And then ultimately, we want to support better decision-making that responds to the unique aspects of our infrastructure and the county, rather than having a one-size-fits-all process, which is what we currently have with specific development. And ultimately, we also want to foster better coordination between the county and the municipalities through implementation of these new regulations. So let me give you kind of a timeline recap really quick. So we finished the master plan update in June 2018. We immediately convened two working groups, one to help us start to think through how we might deal with confined animal feeding operations, and one to help us think through oil and gas regulations. Those two working groups spent about 6 months working and came up with a series of recommendations for the county commissioners. In January 2019, we began the actual work of updating the land use regulations. So we've been working at this for about 18 months now, directly, but indirectly for 2 full years. That initial process really began with data analysis. I'll show you where you can access some of that information if you want to dig back into some of the history. And we really spent those first several months exploring different tools that we could use instead of specific development. And through those initial conversations, did zero in on zoning as really one of the best tools to help us move land use forward in Delta County instead of specific development. In the spring of last year, we did a series of community meetings and community forums, as well as some podcasts to help the county residents and business owners learn about those different land use tools that we were exploring, discuss challenges that we have around the county, and to begin exploring how zoning could work for Delta County by examining how it's worked in other communities. In July, exactly a year ago, we released a white paper that began to outline how zoning could work in Delta County, and any of you that participated in that process, as you read through this new document, should recognize much of the work of that white paper in here, because that really was the starting point for where we are today. Following getting input on that initial white paper, our consultant team began the process of drafting new land use regulations in August of last year, and they brought those forward to us in January of 2020. And that was the concept code that they delivered to the commissioners. And from January through March, the commissioners held numerous work sessions to go through that document, learn it, and also take numerous examples through it to figure out what worked and what didn't work, and made, as a result of that process, made numerous revisions to that concept code. And that is the document that we presented to you now. It's the one that started as a consultant's code, and the commissioners have made numerous revisions to it, and that's the draft in front of you today. We did get a bit of a delay because of COVID, as that has affected everything, and so we are really just getting this community process going now, and we hoped to be doing it earlier this year, but it's where we are. So I'll talk about next steps as we get through this conversation. So real quick today, I'm going to do a very quick overview of what's in the new land use regulations compared to our current regulations, where to find the draft land use code and zoning maps. I'm going to give you some examples of how to use the code, how to provide input, and then next steps. So real quick, The real difference in this document is how we deal with land uses specifically. Today we use specific development, which allows you to ask for anything anywhere, and you might be able to do it depending on whether or not you can satisfy your neighbor's concerns, whether or not you can meet loosely defined criteria. We basically make approvals on a case-by-case basis using a one-size-fits-all process. You have no guarantee of approval or ability to use the property. You go through multiple public meetings in order to find out. It's a very cumbersome process for the property owner and also for the neighbors that have to get involved in that process as well. The requirements for applicants are very unclear. We're proposing to replace that with traditional zoning. The zoning would clearly define what uses are allowed where. It identifies what processes are required based on the intensity of the use. Less impactful uses have little to no process. More impactful uses would go through a process actually very similar to specific development, where you have to go through multiple public hearings to get approval. We believe that the new code provides greater flexibility. It will reduce the time spent on approvals when they're required. And then we also believe that increases the list of uses that are allowed by right. Today in Delta County, under specific development, you really can only do 3 things without asking for permission. And a lot of people don't understand that. Just because we have no zoning does not mean that you can do anything you want. You still have to get approval from the county. The 3 things that you can do are build residences, agriculture, except for those confined animal feeding operations, and you can have a home-based business as long as it's no more than 2,000 square feet and you have no more than 5 employees. Everything else requires approval by the county. So we are trying through this code to reduce or increase the number of things that you can do without asking for permission, but we're giving you guidance on how they have to be done. The next part of this land use code is subdivision. There's really not a lot of difference between what we have today and what is in this document, with one exception. Today, our subdivision codes rely upon a density standard that calculates how many lots you can subdivide based on your surrounding neighborhood and the size of lots around you. That would be replaced by zoning criteria that establish minimum lot sizes and is just hopefully easier for people to understand what they can and can't do in terms of total number of lots that they could potentially create through subdivision. The other big change is process. The majority of lots that are created in Delta County today are done through what's called a 2-lot split. A lot of people refer to them as family splits. It's often because it's somebody carving off a few acres because their son or daughter are moving home and they want a place for them to build something like that. So we often refer to them as family splits. But those 2-lot splits go through a very cumbersome process, just like any other subdivision. They tend to be fairly simple and straightforward. Occasionally there's one that is not simple and straightforward. And this document accommodates for those unique circumstances. But we are proposing that those 2 lots be handled more efficiently through an administrative review process. For 3 or more lots, the subdivision process remains exactly the same. The next big difference in this document between what we have today is how we reference right to farm. Delta County is a right to farm county. We have local policy approved by resolution about right to farm. This document, instead of incorporating the county's policy, really references the stronger right to farm language in the state statutes. Colorado is a right to farm state, and so we've more directly referenced the state statutes rather than our policy. And then we've also extended, per our statutory authority, the right to farm, not just to existing operations, but to future operations as well. During the master plan process, we heard loud and clear the importance of protecting agriculture for our county, and we believe that means ensuring that the next generation of farmers can get up and going as well. And so we've extended that to the next generation of farmers in this code. And then finally, the next big change in this document, today, under our current specific development regulations and our subdivision regulations, if there is an appeal that needs to happen, whether it's by the applicant or by a directly impacted neighbor, your only recourse really is to go to court. This document, the new document, includes an appeals process that would happen through a board of adjustment that acts as a third-party reviewer of decisions in the event that there's a disagreement. That we believe that will reduce costs to appeal for everybody involved and improve due process. And following Board of Adjustments, you still always have the option of court, but it gives property owners an interim, hopefully more cost-effective step to take in the event there's a need for an appeal. Oh, what's going on with my graphics there? Interesting. I don't know if you guys can see my graphics there or not, but in the best place to find the document is to go to deltacountyplan.com, or you can come to our office here, 501 Palmer in Delta, and see Kate and Vivian at our counter, and they can get you a printed copy of it. So let me talk through a little bit of how to use this document. So we've put together a citizen's guide to help people walk through examples on their own property, or maybe on property that you're interested in doing something with, and basically help you walk through different scenarios. That citizen's guide can be found on deltacountyplan.com. There's a direct link to it off of the welcome page. Real quick, before I show you some examples, let me just run through what is in the document. So Chapter 1 addresses the intent. It addresses how we're going to interpret this document, and it also addresses the roles of decision makers. The decision makers are the Board of County Commissioners, the Planning Commission, the Board of Adjustments, and the Planning Director. Chapter 2, if you're most concerned about land use in particular, Chapter 2 is the chapter you want to really spend some time on. That is the chapter that establishes zoning, and it also establishes use-specific standards for any of the uses that are listed as limited use or conditional use, and I'll explain those in a moment. Chapter 3 through 6 are general standards and criteria. These are the criteria that all development in Delta County will be required to meet. A lot of them are similar to our existing subdivision regulations, but there's more specificity that we've built in overall. Chapter 7 is the standardized application and review process, and Chapter 8 is the decision-making process, both whether meetings are, what kind of meetings are required and who is responsible for making the decision. Chapter 9 discusses the effects of approvals and denials. And then chapters 10 through 12 really address the unusual circumstances, things like appeals and variances, modifications, nonconformities, those things that happen occasionally but are not common. And then chapter 13 is enforcement, and chapter 14 is definitions. If you are most concerned about land use, chapter 14 and those definitions is also a very important chapter to be looking through and reading those definitions. They go hand in hand with chapter 2. So another really important piece of this document is land use table, which is table 2B, located in chapter 2. This is the document that establishes the zone districts. There's 5 proposed zone districts. Oops. There's 5 proposed zone districts. And then all of the different types of land uses. And then in this chart, you will see the A's, the P's, the L's, and the C's. So anything that has an A beside it is something that you are allowed to do by right. It is something you can do without asking for permission, but that doesn't mean you can do it outside of the requirements of the code. So if there is a setback, for example, you can do it without permission, but you need to make sure you're meeting the setback. That's the easiest example there. Anything that is listed as a P is permitted. You have to get a zoning permit in order to move forward with your use, but that is an administrative review process that happens at our counter. It would happen at the same time that you are getting an address, access, or septic permit. We would do a quick counter review where we would verify that you're meeting the minimum requirements of the code, and then if you are, the planning staff would sign off on it and you can move forward. The next criteria are L's. Those are limited use. There are 3 things to keep in mind about limited uses. Number 1, they also require a zoning permit, but you're going to be reviewed against all of the criteria. You can be approved or denied based on whether or not you are meeting the criteria in the code. You could also be conditionally approved. Anything that has an asterisk by it requires public notice. Public notice with the others that do not have an asterisk is at the discretion of the planning director. And the planning director or the applicant could say that this application actually needs to go in front of the planning commission and the county commissioners because of its complexity or because it can't meet the criteria and it won't be approved administratively. So it gives us sort of that either or option for moving forward. And then finally, those that have a C in front of them are conditional uses, and those would be processed very similar to how specific development is processed today. What we've tried to do with this chart is recognize that there are lower impact or no impact uses, and they should have a quick, easy path forward. And there are more complex and more impactful projects that really need to have a greater level of review happen on them. So we tried to create that spectrum so that you can do those simple things without much regulatory burden, but those things that are more complex still need to go through that higher review process. I don't know if you can see the zoning maps there. I don't know why my images are not coming through, at least on my screen. Hopefully you guys can see them. If not, that's okay. We will answer questions here in a moment. In the zoning map, you'll see those zoning categories. A35 is green on the zoning map. It is the vast majority of the county. That is our agricultural zone district, but it is also a residential zone district. A20 is, back up. A35 is for properties that are typically 35 acres or larger. A20 is the next category. It's also an agriculture zone district with a heavy residential component as well. Those are properties that are typically 20 acres or larger. And then A5 is really more residential, although you could certainly be doing agriculture as well, but maybe it's heavier on the residential side than the agricultural side. And those are properties that are typically 5 acres or larger. The gray areas are rural, industrial, commercial, and the urban growth areas, which are purple, are the areas around the municipalities that the municipalities have identified in their master plans as areas that they intend to grow into and provide services into the future. I apologize if you're not seeing the map. I don't know why it's not uploading. I think it's probably a slow internet thing, so I apologize for that. Let me escape. Let me put you on pause for one moment. I'm gonna see if I can restart this PowerPoint and fix that. Close that really quick. Give me one moment here to grab that. See if that fixes the presentation. Can everybody see that now? The graphics come up? Okay, I'm seeing heads nod. Perfect. All right. Let's see here. All right, so let me give you a few examples of how those P's, A's, L's, and C's would work. So, and this is how you would walk through this document as you're thinking through examples, and the citizens guide that we put together is designed to help you walk through this in the exact same way. So let's take a land use. I want to start a winery. What would be required of me? The first thing I want to do is go to those definitions in chapter 14 and figure out which of the land use categories a winery falls under. The documents are on the website, are searchable. If you are ever struggling to figure it out, you just call our office and we'll help you figure out which of those categories would apply. In this case, it is going to be under the rural light industry category. So I'm going to look at the zoning map next, and I'm going to figure out, between looking at the map and table 2E, which zone districts would I need to be looking at for rural light industry. And in this example, when I look at the table, If I am planning rural light industry with retail, I would have to go through a permitted use review in all of the zone districts. If I'm looking at rural light industry without retail, it would be allowed, and I wouldn't have to come and ask or get approval at all. But that might factor into my decision making as to how I would want to run my business. So I'm going to do the without retail option. Let's say I'm just going to manufacture my wine and bottle it and package it to ship out. Then really the only thing I would need to do is make sure that I understand what those minimum requirements are, things like setbacks. If I'm going to be building, a little building for my processing and packaging, for example, I need to make sure that I build it in the proper away from the property lines and meet that minimum setback, for example. But I can just do it. I can go and I can start my business up. If I'm going to do that winery though, and I want to have a retail component, I want a tasting room, I want to have sales happening, then what I would do is I would come to the county offices to get my zoning permit. I would submit my application showing that I meet those minimum requirements. In this case, it might be, making sure I have adequate access, water, sewer, and parking. In this case, parking would be important. We would want to make sure that, if you've got 500 square feet of retail space, that you have enough parking spaces that you don't have people parking out on the county road, for example, to be able to come in and visit your winery, that you can accommodate that on your site. You would submit your plans to staff, they would review them, and as long as you meet all the criteria, you would get your zoning permit. Let's take an example with a limited use. So in this example, I want to start an auto body shop. So I'm going to start with definitions. I'm going to go figure out where auto body shops would be in that list of land use categories. And in this case, it's rural medium industry. Next thing I'm going to do is look at the land use table and the map so that I can figure out, where, which zone district is accommodating the uses I want. In this particular example, it's a limited use regardless of zone district. So this is how and what the process would look like. I would still need my zoning permit. I would come in, I'd submit an application that includes a sketch plan that just demonstrates how I'm meeting the requirements of the code. In this case, again, it's going to be water, sewer, access, parking, maybe screening of outdoor storage, maybe demonstrating that I have a hazardous materials disposal plan for the chemicals that I might be using in my facility. There might be some other things that we would want to look at as well based on the criteria. Staff would review those plans. They'd send them out to referral agencies. Director might decide that public notice to your neighbors is also required. And then if you can demonstrate that you meet all the requirements and you can meet anything that comes up from the referral agencies, staff would then issue the zoning permit. If, let's say, there's a lot of controversy around it or you can't meet the minimum standards, then staff can send your request to the planning commission or county commissioners for them to review and approve it. Then finally, let's look at the conditional use example. So in this example, I want to start a manufacturing plant. I'm going to have a lot of outdoor storage, lots of truck traffic, and I'll likely generate a lot of noise and dust. In this particular example, I've already bought property though. I bought this little tiny piece right here that's orange. And so now I want to understand what I can do. So in this example, I would need to get a site plan approval and a zoning permit. So difference between a sketch plan and a site plan is that a site plan is drawn to scale, where we are not just verifying that what you're doing conceptually, but we're really verifying it actually, what you're doing. You have to demonstrate that you can meet all of the criteria in the code. In this example, thinking water, sewer, access, parking, setbacks from residential uses, screening of outdoor storage, hazardous material disposal, dust control, noise control, all those things that address those impacts that you are going to be having. Your request will go to 2 public hearings, one with the Planning Commission and one with the Board of County Commissioners, and then the commissioners can approve or deny your request or approve it with conditions. Let me back up for a second because I want to show you a distinction here. When I look at my land use table, you will see that to get my rural heavy industry, my my manufacturing plant, I'd be a limited review in A35 and a limited review in A20 and a conditional review in A5. So this property I selected and that I already bought is actually A5. That's why I'm going through a conditional process. If I had looked for and bought property in the rural industrial commercial zone, I would be able to move forward through a permit rather than going through a cumbersome multi-step public hearing process. We specifically identified these rural industrial commercial sites so that there is a place for industry to locate to and incentivize it locating into those places by reducing that burden to them. You can still request to move forward on the A5, but you're going to go through a much more cumbersome process to get there. If you identify and try to do something on property that's properly zoned, then you have a much easier path forward. All right, I've kind of talked about subdivision a little bit, so I'm going to skip that slide.
I want to address the lot splits that neighbors will still be.
Yes, good point. So I will hit subdivision really quick. So on subdivisions, I mentioned earlier that 2 lot splits will be done administratively. They still will go through a thorough review process. All applications will be sent to all referral agencies and to adjacent property owners. Issues and conditions that come up will be addressed through the review and approval process. What is cut out is the multiple public hearings, but the intensity of the review does not change. We still will do a thorough review of each of those requests to ensure adequate water, adequate protection of quality of the features on the land, that sort of thing. So let me run through a couple more tools that are available for you. You can read through our frequently asked questions on the deltacountyplan.com website. I'd encourage you to do that and read through those. We've tried to address the things that are coming up frequently throughout this whole review process all the way back to last year. I've already talked about the Citizens Guide. That is there for you as well to help you walk through these examples and flip through this document from section to section without having to read it cover to cover, although you're welcome to read it cover to cover as well. Let me give you a quick review on how to provide feedback. So first and foremost, there is a forum at deltacountyplan.com. You can go to the share your comments link at the top of the page and then join the conversation tab right here. And we do have a forum where you can ask your questions, interact with others. We've been having, I think this is our 4th meeting or the last 2 weeks. It is our last meeting for this round. You can email your comments to Delta County Land Use at deltacounty.com. You can snail mail your comments. And if you've got other questions or comments and you want to have a conversation with us, give me a call and we will set up a time to talk with you as well. So with that, tomorrow is our deadline for comments on this first round. I want to emphasize that this is our first draft that we brought out to you guys. Our intent is to gather initial feedback from these meetings we've been having for the last 2 weeks and sit down with the commissioners here in the next week or so and determine what changes need to be made to this document based on the initial feedback that we've gotten. And then we will be putting it back out to you for review and comment again prior to gearing up to take this through an approval process. So there will be another round of community input here probably within the next 2 to 3 weeks. So keep your eyes and ears open. Following that, after we do the second round of input, we will then gear up for those public hearings to move it towards adoption. So our goal is to get this done here late summer, early fall. So with that, I see a couple questions that have come up on the chat, so I think we'll start with those. And then we'll take questions from you directly. So let me start here with how were the meetings over the last 2 weeks advertised? So we had information in the DCI. We put it out on Facebook. We did a press release that went out to all media. And then we have an email list on Delta that's part of our deltacountyplan.com website that has about 430 emails on it that we also sent out to. And those will continue to be the ways that we advertise moving forward. The next question is, what is the timeline to hire the required staffing and implementation of the land use regulations?
We, first and foremost, we really need to get through this process. We need to figure out what this round of comments is going to bring us, what changes we have to make to this draft document. As soon as we get a document that we think the people agree with for the most part, then it'll go in front of the planning commission, then it'll come in front of the commissioners. After we have a fully executed document, then we're going to have to start looking at a staff person that is going to be able to implement this document. There's going to be a lot of education that's going to have to take place. We're not going to be able to just go out and start expecting people to understand this document immediately. So, you know, we're really kind of baby stepping this thing a little bit, just because this is a big change for Delta County, and it is going to take a lot to get everybody on board with understanding what's going on. If you go out to your average Delta County resident, there's probably about 5% of the population out there that have any clue about land use in Delta County, because unless you've experienced it yourself, you don't understand what's going on. So to make this kind of change and expect the entire population of the county to understand it immediately is just not going to happen. So as far as time frames, everything this year in 2020, every time frame we've set has been kicked in the rear. So I really struggle with coming up with a specific time frame, but I'm really hoping by the end of the year we have some staff members ready to go and starting out there really informing the public of what's involved in this.
The next question I see on here is, what size can the lots be when able to split? So for that, you want to look at page 51 of the document there. This is lot dimensions by zoning district. So typically, and I'm using the word typically on purpose, I'll tell you why in half a second. In the A35 zone district, the minimum lot size is 35 acres, 20 acres in A20, and 5 acres in A5, 2 acres in the rural industrial zone, and 7,500 square feet in the urban growth area. That is intended for urban growth in that area. The commissioners can approve lot sizes that are less than that, but they have to meet the criteria under Chapter 3, Section 1A, which is variations to lot size. So smaller lots can be done, but they do need to meet those criteria in order to get to a smaller lot.
And one of the things to add to that is the problem with implementing a zoning plan in a county that's never had zoning is we have, you know, a lot of 80-acre parcels sitting right next to a 1-acre parcel. So to try to individually zone each of those, we would look like such a checkerboard. It would be impossible to implement. So that is why we have the language in there for the variation of the lot size.
We'll move out of the chat. I've got one more question, maybe two more questions here that I'm flipping through on my screen, and start taking questions directly. If you would like to ask a question, I'd ask you to actually use the chat function and just say, I'd like to ask a question, and I will, and unmute yourself, and I'll call on people as I see you come through on the chat that you're interested in speaking and asking a question. But I've got two more questions that have already been typed in that I want to address. So first of all, Steve Harper asked us to identify the speakers. It's Commissioner Supis is in here with me helping to answer questions. The next one is, do we anticipate multiple rounds of drafts of this land use document open for public comment? So what I'm envisioning, and correct me if you think it's different, is that there will be at least 2 more rounds of this document. There will be a version of this that incorporates initial feedback that we put back out for feedback. We will then incorporate any feedback we get from that will go into a 3rd revision of this document, and it is our goal to take that document forward into the public hearing process. So yes, I envision that there'll be a couple more versions of this document before we are in final adoption. And then last one is more of a statement than a question. So Don, if you want to address that, so it's regarding the oil and gas component of this document, which is there is a placeholder for it in this document as opposed to being in this document. Do you want to explain why?
We purposely left this out of our document, mostly because our prior oil and gas regulations were not adequate for what they needed to be, and because the state was taking on a whole new level of rulemaking. And we have said from the word go that when the state is done with their rulemaking, then we will go back, we will look at where we're at, and we will look at adopting those oil and gas regulations at that time. What we have currently that is not regulated by the state is so minimal that it is not worth the legal liability that we were facing with the lawsuits that the county was receiving, and it was a poor use of taxpayer dollars to try to defend a document that was inadequate.
Our intent is we've been paying attention to the state's process as they work to implement Senate Bill 181. The commissioners have stated over and over that they do not want to duplicate anything the state does. They want to understand where the state is going to land in terms of citing and regulation over the industry under the new requirements of Senate Bill 181. And then we will create new oil and gas regulations for the county that address our more specific needs once we have a better sense of what the state is doing. And in that land use table, that to be table, you will see that there is a placeholder for oil and gas extraction to be added into this table once that'll be our follow-up to this document. So I haven't seen anybody state in the chat would like to ask a question. So let me stop sharing my screen and see if anybody has questions. If so, if you would unmute yourself, and I'll try to manage without having people step on top of each other here. Is there any other questions anyone would like to ask? Okay. Here we go. Joanne would like to. Go ahead, Joanne.
All right, it took me a while to type. I was typing my question. Okay, you mentioned the working groups. The CAFO working group was disbanded because they couldn't come to a unanimous agreement. And that was a requirement of both those working teams, that in order to make a recommendation, it had to be unanimous agreement. So I'm curious, who and how did the proposed process get decided? Since essentially what you're proposing, what's being proposed here is limited use with the asterisk. It's a little confusing to have an L and then an L and an asterisk, but another question, another point. Limited use with public notice, process designation. And given the huge controversy surrounding CAFOs, that seems again, it was a complaint of mine and several people early on, and it continues to be a complaint. It seems extremely lenient given the controversy in our community. So I'm kind of wondering just how that was decided, since it doesn't seem that the CAFO working group was taken into consideration.
So Joanne, actually, if you would recall, the CAFO working group met for about 6 months. They actually met with the Planning Commission and the commissioners in December of 2018. And at that time, you're correct, they did not reach consensus on everything that had been our goal to try to get to consensus. Instead, what that group decided to do was that each individual would make their recommendation as to what they thought the regulations should look like. So we had really the full spectrum of regulation suggestions, from very, very lenient to very, very restrictive. And then we had a series of recommendations that were more middle of the road that several of the working group members really agreed mostly on, with maybe some little nuancy differences. And the working group at that time, and based on the fact that they could not reach consensus, it was determined that they would each present their thoughts to the county commissioners, which they did in December of 2018, and ultimately the commissioners would look at all of that range of recommendations and pull out what they thought would make the most amount of sense. So what you have in our document is a combination of the recommendations that came out of the working group. The one thing that they did reach consensus on was definitions, and getting consensus on that alone was very helpful. That's something that we lacked before. And then the series of recommendations on criteria and how to approach things. What you see is a really pulling out of those middle of the road recommendations out of the working group is what the commissioners have worked to put into this document. Do you want to add to that, Don?
Just the fact that, that CAFO working group did bring in a lot of information. There was incredible amounts of state and federal regulations that were brought into the picture, a lot of research done by other entities that, it was a fact-finding mission as part of what the CAFO working group did. And we have try to utilize as much of that as possible.
Thank you. If I might ask one last question, it's for me. Lower. You stated a couple times that those things you guys identified as lower impact to make things easier to go forward. Among them, slaughterhouses, meat processing, sawmills, explosives, and rock crushing. Kind of blew my mind to see those in the L. Those don't seem like, to your average person, they don't seem like low impact to me. They seem extremely high, in fact. Can you help me understand that, please?
You got to think small picture on a lot of these also. Just because you can open up a slaughterhouse and handle 1 or 2 animals a week and still be under the slaughterhouse rules under our definitions. So just because it's got a big name doesn't mean it's going to be a big operation. So we got to think about these on the smaller end of the process also.
That's part of why we included in there that L's could be kicked to conditional uses. So if something that came in was on the small end of that spectrum, might move forward administratively, but if it was a larger facility and it was having a lot of controversy, that would be a good reason for the planning director to kick it into a conditional use.
Thank you.
Steve, you noted you'd like to say something. Please do.
Just to respond to your response to Joanne about the CAFO working group, I've read the draft code, and I would have to say that based upon my recollection, at least those setbacks of CAFO's agricultural, intensive agricultural uses, as it's stated, are about the least restrictive of anybody's proposal in that CAFO working group. That 1 foot per animal unit standard is totally arbitrary, and it is the least restrictive that was mentioned. It is not middle of the road at all.
I think you're right. I don't disagree with you, Steve, that those are definitely the lesser of the standards that were put forward. So
thanks for clearing that up.
Any other questions?
This is Richard Rudin. I'd just like to make a few comments, if that's okay.
He's Rich.
Well, the first is you started out with such a heavy emphasis on fair and predictable. I like the fair part. I don't understand the emphasis on predictable. You've got planning commissioners and county commissioners, and they ought to be able to deal with spontaneous and random applications. There's always going to be an application, no matter what is in or what is out, that pushes the envelope that is going to be needed to be decided. And if the people who are on these boards, aren't up to the task of making hard decisions, it seems to me you've taken the hard decision-making process away from the people in authority and shifted it to your constituents in the sense of a financial burden, because I thought you said the remedy is to go straight to court. There is no more talk about compatibility or anything else. It's just bing, bang, boom, done. So that's my first comment. And then a follow-up to Steve's comment on setbacks. I would like to ask, and this is in the form of a comment here, why in a time of respiratory pandemic predicted to last for years to come, would you relax setback recommendations to allow for a closer discharge of fecal material and bacteria? Your proposal understands that there's potential respiratory problems, or you wouldn't have created a proper setback around schools. What I don't understand is why are school children in more need of protection than someone like me, old, in the defined COVID-19 vulnerable group, and with previous lung trauma? I won't go on for too long. Don't get nervous. I've heard it said that a chicken barn's emissions or dust are no better or worse than to be found anywhere in rural areas. I think that's too simplistic. A barn's ventilation is nothing like an outside cow-calf operation. I think of fans blowing feces and bacteria out as more like a shotgun blast. A tight, close, intense start at the point of origin and a widening out with distance. So maybe in a quarter or half mile, that befoulment is trivial, but close up, it's disease waiting to happen. Your own study concluded that will be a percentage of predisposed to these bacteria and negative effects. Now with COVID-19 not going away soon, there will be exponentially more persons predisposed with pre-existing respiratory vulnerabilities. Where is the science that confirms 150 feet is safe from my house? Don't you think it's negligent to knowingly put more citizens in harm's way for little to no gain for the county? I get that chicken farms can be a good thing for the stay-at-home rancher family, but where is the financial benefit to the county to incentivize such a business? I know my property value would halve the instant a neighbor of mine would install a chicken barn 150 feet from my boundary. I think this is a terrible idea, and I think the idea that if I want to do a land split so that my son and his family can live here and see me through the last decades is made more onerous. Instead, you want them to put me in a nursing home? That's like a death sentence these days. So I strongly urge you, if you want to attract entrepreneurs and retirees with means, do not adopt these two concepts. Thank you.
Richard, first of all, to address your first comments about predictable, 90% of what we see is the same thing over and over with 2 lot splits. Our goal with this is to try to make this a more streamlined process on 90% of what we see, understanding that 10% that does require more attention from staff, from planning commission, from the commissioners, is still goes through the process. So, as far as predictable, there's always, like you said, there's always going to be that interesting proposal that comes out that's going to take time and effort and gnashing of the teeth from both parties to make sure it gets through. But we're trying to make it a little easier on the simple things that do happen. And then, secondly, on your CAFO comments, I assume you have that written someplace. If you would kindly forward that so we can input that in our comments and have a record of that, what you've written, please.
Yep, I'll send it to Elise via email.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Elise, I have a question.
Who said, I'm looking for where that came from.
This is Bob Kalanick. We're sharing the computer here.
Got it. Go ahead, Bob.
You mentioned expanding the right to farm basically to allow for stripping of any nuisance complaints from not only existing operations, but new operations that move next door to you. Where in the document is that? We couldn't find it. That's my one question. The next is, could you talk a little bit about why the county would want to threaten people's property rights with that sort of thing? And what is the logic behind such a thing?
So I'll let the commissioner talk to your second question while I get you a page reference.
So after extensive work with staff and consultants in the master plan, preservation of agriculture was the primary goal that came out of the master plan. And that is why we are basically, accenting what state statute says on right to farm.
The state statute does not address anything but existing ag operations with the encroachment of new development, not the other way around, Commissioner. So that's not correct. The bottom line is the master plan also wanted to encourage and protect property rights for new businesses coming in. If you put in a bed and breakfast and next door you have a CAFOs put in after the fact and you have no option for nuisance complaints, that bed and breakfast is put at risk, or any business of the nature.
Point taken.
I have to do a Google search or quick search. Give me half a second, Bob, and I'll get you that reference.
Thank you. We
We'll
had
find.
searched for it and could not find it.
It is under environmental quality, section 7 in chapter 4 on page 79.
Thank you, Elise. I'll look for
Yep.
it.
All right, any final questions? All right, well, thank you very much. Again, comments on this first draft are due tomorrow. We intend to bring a second draft out to you very quickly so that we can continue this conversation and keep things going. Stay in touch with deltacountyplan.com and stay in touch with our Facebook site as well for updates. And then if you're on our email list, you'll get an email as soon as the next draft is ready for comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.